Well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. I'm going to talk very briefly about three three related topics. I'm going to begin by, it's the intersection between climate change and problems of inequality. I want to begin with the basic problem facing the global economy today, and it's the insufficiency of aggregate demand. That is to say, the reason that growth this year is the lowest it's been since the crisis of 2008-9, and one of the poorest years in decades, is that there is a lack of aggregate demand. There are a whole variety of reasons for this. Austerity is one. Government cutbacks in Europe are very widely discussed. But even in the United States, there's been a mild form of austerity. We have about 500,000 fewer public sector employees than we had before the crisis. With normal expansion, we would have 2 million more public sector employees. So the shortfall is 2.5 million. That's a serious dose of austerity that is responsible in large measure for the weakness in the U.S. economy. What I want to argue is that actually there is no reason for this lack of aggregate demand. That is to say, we could obviously easily change the course and stimulate our economy and address two of the country's major problems. One of them, the world's problems, inequality and climate change. There are a lot of people who say, well, we can't deal with climate change in the midst of a financial crisis, a weak economy. I would argue quite the contrary, that this is even more imperative to address it now. A few years ago, Ben Bernanke, when he was chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, said that there was a savings glut. And when he said that, I thought he was living on a different planet than I was living, because when you're talking about a savings glut, you're talking about the balance between savings and investment, or more accurately, savings and investment needs. And as I look around the world, in Africa, even in the United States, there are huge needs for infrastructure, huge needs for investments in people, investments in education, investments in technology, and most importantly, for what I want to focus on here, investments to retrofit the global economy for climate change, which is a big deal, and it's investments that are going to have to take place in every aspect of our economy, not just electricity generation, but we're talking about restructuring our cities, public transportation systems, housing, every aspect. So these are huge investment needs, far beyond the savings that occurs. So there's a mystery here. Bernanke is saying we have a savings glut. I look around and I say we have actually a huge investment needs, and at the same time, it's very clear that we have underutilized resources in most countries around the world. In the United States, the official unemployment rate is a little over 5%, but there's a huge amount of disguised unemployment, what I would call the true unemployment, but how you look at the is much more, is well in excess of 10%. And in Europe, the official unemployment rate is 12%. Youth unemployment is 25%. So clearly we have excess capacity, and we have these huge investment needs. So the question is, what is the problem? Well, I don't want to, there's lots of things wrong, and the poor financial sector has been battered since the global financial crisis, which they played a central role in creating. But I want to say that the problem is essentially the financial market. And by that I mean the following. Most of the discussion since the crisis has focused on trying to prevent the financial sector from imposing harm on the rest of our society, harm in the form of excess risk-taking, harm in the form of market manipulation. There was just another case of a settlement on a Forex manipulation case, but all kinds of market manipulation, all kinds of harms associated with the financial market. But the real issue is the financial market hasn't been doing the functions which it's supposed to be doing. And what are those functions? The most important function is intermediating between the savings and the investment needs of our society. So that's the failure that I think is really the most important failure. We have all the savings, so much savings that Bernanke would call it a glut, and we have all these investment needs, they're obvious, and the financial markets, whose societal function is to bring these two together, hasn't been doing that. In fact, if you look at the data in the United States, the financial sector has not been intermediating between savers and investors. It's been disintermediation. The real function of the financial market in the United States in the last couple of decades has been taking money out of corporations and actually meaning that there's less money to invest in jobs and in capital and so forth. Well, the problem is even deeper than what I've just suggested, because if you look at those investment projects, they are mostly long-term investment projects. Infrastructure, for instance, is a long-term investment project. You look at a lot of the savings that are going on, it's long-term savers. Sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, people are saving for retirement 30, 40 years from then. So we have these long-term savers and we have these long-term investment projects. But in between, we have these remarkably short-sighted financial markets who are worrying about next quarterly return. So no wonder things aren't working well. So that's where the important agenda, one of the important agenda, going forward is trying to understand why our financial markets aren't doing what they're supposed to do, not doing this intermediation, and why they are so short-term when our society needs long-term institutions to intermediate between the two. That's part of the agenda that I've been involved in and a number of other people involved in, called Rewriting the Rules of the American Economy. There's a similar project going on in Europe called Rewriting the Rules of the European Economy. And one aspect of rewriting the rules is to try to understand how our legal system, our tax system, our whole society has led to this system of short-termism on the financial markets, and how that is, in turn, undermining the functioning of the market economy. And there's a whole host of specific changes in the rules and way our economy has functioned over the last third of a century that have led to these consequences. Tax changes which have encouraged stock options, disclosure requirements that have not led to disclosure of relevant information that has in turn also led to, contributed to the support of stock options, which encouraged short-termism. Rulings about what is meant by fiduciary action on the part of the owners of the pension funds and other foundations that are acting as trustees. The fiduciaries are not allowed to look at the long term. We're trying to change some of those rules to identify what are the rules that have led to short-termism so that we can now know how to rewrite those rules to try to lead to a more functioning economy with a focus on the long term. And you'll see at least one or two of the candidates in this coming election reflecting this agenda of trying to rewrite the rules to encourage longer-term investments. And you've heard of some of this refrain from people even in the financial market who've recognized that things aren't working well. So that's the first topic I wanted to bring out. And the point I want to emphasize is that if we did this, we would have better investments for longer-term economic growth, higher employment, and a better functioning economy today and in the future. A second topic I wanted to bring up just very quickly is growing inequality. our understanding, the fact that there's such focus on inequality is understandable because inequality has reached levels that had not been seen since 1929, before in the Great Depression or the Gilded Age at the end of the 19th century. The share of the top 1% has doubled. The share of the top 1/10 of 1% has increased almost fourfold in the last 30 years or so. These are dramatic changes. When I was a graduate student, what we tried to explain was why the distribution of income wasn't changing. Now we have to explain why it's changing so rapidly, because there aren't good explanations of underlying changes in demand and supply that can explain the magnitude of these changes. We're beginning to get a better grasp. There is a controversy. Piketty has done some very important work in identifying in pointing out the magnitude of this increase, and pointing out as well that the period after World War II was an unusual period in the history of capitalism, the only period in which inequality was very low. But that doesn't answer the question of why has it suddenly started to increase. Now, he sees this as a combination of the 1950s being a very unusual period because of the solidarity brought by World War II, allowing for much higher tax rates, and even with those higher tax rates, we grew much faster. But he focuses on mostly savings, and differences in savings rates at different parts of society at the very top. If you look at really what's been going on, though, in the United States, that doesn't provide and in most other countries, it provide a very adequate explanation. Because one of the startling facts of what's happened in the United States is that productivity of workers has continued to grow almost unchanged before 1980 and after 1980. A little slower growth after 1980, but not much difference. But historically, until 1980, when productivity increased, wages increased in tandem. What the real break is in around 1980 was that productivity continued to grow, but wages stagnated. And that is the unusual thing that has happened. And our interpretation of that has to do with, it's not the differences in savings rate. It really has to do with, again, we rewrote the rules of the market economy in ways that advantaged a few at the top and disadvantaged the vast majority. And again, it's important to understand how, but greater scope for market power, monopoly power, weaker unions, a whole set of institutional changes. Important lesson is that markets don't exist in a vacuum. We structure markets. And through our legal frameworks, our institutional frameworks, if we run the economy with a lot of slack, if the Federal Reserve focuses on inflation rather than unemployment, and we wind up with a higher unemployment rate, which has happened while we were focusing so much on inflation. We didn't have more stability, but we had higher unemployment. That results in a weaker bargaining power of workers, and that's going to lead to lower wages. And that's been happening not only in the United States, but in countries around the world. So you look more closely at what's happened in savings in the United States, savings out of national income. What one sees is actually the capital output ratio in the United States has been falling. And that is quite contrary to what Piketty emphasizes, which is the wealth-income ratio has been going up. Well, wealth and capital are two different concepts. Capital are productive things like machines. Wealth goes up if, for instance, the value of land goes up because the monetary authority is lending out a lot of money, not going into productive capital, not lending money for companies to expand their businesses, but lending capital to people to speculate on land. And we have a tax system that encourages that land speculation. Then you have land prices going up. But are we wealthier because the value of land in Southampton is higher? Well, some people are wealthier, but is our society as a whole wealthier? There's not more land there. There's just a higher value of land. In France, it's the same thing. The value of land in the Riviera has gone up, but the wealth of France has gone down. So that is the fundamental mistake that Piketty made, and it's important to understand what is going on. As another example, if monopoly power goes up, the capitalized value of monopoly power will go up, and that's share value. But that is an increase in the recorded value of the wealth, but the wealth of consumers has gone down because their real income is going down. So that's just a transfer. If we have a financial system, a government, that bails out the banks, the value of that bailout is going to go up in the shareholder value of the shares. But the wealth of the taxpayers is going down. And in fact, the wealth of the economy is going down because this is an inefficient redistribution of income. So we've done a lot of things to increase wealth, but reduce capital and make our country poor. And this is going on in country after country. Well, I want to link this very quickly to climate change, because it is very clear that climate change is both real and will increase inequality both within countries and across countries. The poorest countries are those in the tropics, and they are the countries that will be most affected. We all will be affected. One of the dimensions of climate change is increased variability in temperature, and that will affect everybody, and is affecting us. But the tropics are going to be affected more, and they're more dependent on agriculture, and agriculture is going to be affected more. So inequality between countries is going to increase, and inequality within countries is going to increase, partly because the poor are the least able to cope with these changes in the climate. And there'll probably be increase in disease vectors. We already, seen dramatic data for the United States in the Deaton case study, pointing out the life expectancy of white males is going down. A striking thing when that in the rest of the world is going up, reflecting the growing inequality. One of the new insights that we've had with my work called The Price of Inequality, and with the work of the IMF and the OECD, is that we are paying a high price for this inequality. Not only is it morally wrong, but it actually impedes economic performance. It leads to lower growth and more economic instability. So again, there's a connection between climate change and economic performance. If climate change leads to more inequality is going to likely be associated with poor economic performance. And again, it's in our interest to deal with the issue of climate change. I want to, in the last few minutes, just say a few words about the meeting in Paris. It's quite clear that the magnitude of the commitments that are being made in Paris are not going to add up anywhere near to what is needed to prevent climate change of the 2 degrees centigrade that was agreed to in Copenhagen. I believe that the voluntary approach that Obama has been talking about is not going to work, is a failure. I sympathize with him because given our Congress, there's not much else he can do. So it's better than nothing. So given the circumstances, it is the right policy. But I think we should recognize that a system based on voluntary compliance is not likely to be adequate. And we will have to have a global agreement eventually. I've argued in one of my books called Making Globalization Work that we ought to begin by approaching this with a coalition of the willing, to borrow a phrase that I know has gotten a sort of tainted term, but those countries that are committed to doing something about climate change get together and make a binding commitment among themselves and have cross-border tariffs. That is to say, impose tariffs against dirty products produced in countries that are not part of the agreement. And I argue that that is actually consistent with WTO agreements. In fact, if you don't charge for carbon, you are in effect subsidizing the production of goods in a dirty way. And subsidies are illegal under the WTO. So I've argued that actually countries that do not charge a price for carbon or otherwise regulate it in effect like a carbon price are violating the WTO, the spirit of the WTO and probably the letter of the WTO. So I think the countries that have recognized this should make a commitment to reductions in carbon, a carbon price, whatever form it can take, and impose cross-border taxes on the trade from any country that doesn't go along. That will change incentives, I think, within the United States to come to an agreement. But I also want to share the view that I think it's important to see Paris as a success, even if it doesn't get to a full set of commitments equal to what are required for 2 degrees, because it's important to create the recognition of momentum towards a long-run agreement. Why is that important? Well, that comes to the fact that the business community has to begin to make climate investments. And these investments are a lot of the key investments are long-term investments. We talked a little before about energy generation, transport systems, real estate. All of these are long-term investments. The decisions that we make today are going to be with us 30, 40, 50 years from now. And if we don't make them in a carbon appropriate way, we are going to be stuck with an economy that is going to have higher levels of carbon emissions. And what we'll have to do to get carbon emissions down will be even more difficult. So if we can convince the business community that, okay, Paris was not the success we would have wanted, but the world is clearly moving in that direction. There will be an agreement. Not this year, but in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. And it's better now to start making those green investments, to recognize that it doesn't pay to make big investments in carbon-intensive technologies. For those in the hydrocarbon business, there's already probably more carbon discovered at reasonable extraction costs than the world can use given the 2 degrees goal. And therefore, exploration should be focused only on low extraction cost and low emission kinds of areas. I think if we can get that understanding to come out of Paris, that will be an important movement forward in trying to create the kind of carbon-friendly environment, a green environment that we need if we're going to survive. Thank you.